Tonight in the Chapel of Poetry extra reading, prose reading, I'm going to do a reading from my father's favorite book, A People's History of the United States. And since I'm doing this in light of last night's second presidential debate between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Which reminds me of this shirt that I'm wearing, which is the Young Turks shirt. It's one of my favorite YouTube shows where one of the first places I go to get news behind like Democracy Now! And Thom Hartmann and NPR is another place I get my news from. And in this shirt we have the forces of light against the forces of evil. And the forces of evil is represented by Donald Trump, which is the oligarchy of America. And the forces of light is a more objective journalism. It's more objective journalism that is represented by Cenk Uygur and Anna Kasparian. And so without much further ado, I'm going to read a few pages from The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, starting on chapter 15, Self-Help in Hard Times. The war was hardly over. It was February 1919. The IWW leadership was in jail, but the IWW idea of the general strike became reality for 5 days in Seattle, Washington, when a walkout of 100,000 working people brought the city to a halt. It began with 35,000 shipyard workers striking for a wage increase. They appealed the support to the Seattle Central Labor Council, which recommended a citywide strike, and in 2 weeks, 110 locals, mostly American Federation of Labor, only a few of the IWW voted to strike. The rank and file of each striking local elected and 3 members of the General Strike Committee, and on February 6, 1919, at 10 a.m., the strike began. Unity was not easy to achieve. The IWW locals were in tension with the AFL locals. Japanese locals were admitted to the General Strike Committee, but were not given a vote. Still, 60,000 union members were out, and 40,000 other workers joined in sympathy. Seattle workers had a radical tradition. During the war, the president of the Seattle AFL Socialists was imprisoned for imposing the draft, was tortured, and there were great labor rallies in the streets to protest. The city now stopped functioning except for activities organized by the strikers to provide essential needs. Firemen agreed to stay on the job. Laundry workers handled only hospital laundry. Vehicles authorized to move carried signs, exempted by the General Strike Committee. 35 neighborhoods milk stations were set up. Every day, 30,000 meals were prepared in large kitchens and then transported to the halls all over the city and served cafeteria style with strikers paying 25 cents a meal. The general public, 35 cents. People were allowed to eat as much as they wanted of the beef stew, spaghetti, bread, and coffee. A labor war veterans guard was organized to keep the peace. On the blackboard at one of its headquarters was written, "The purpose of this organization is to preserve law and order without the use of force. No volunteer will have any police power or be allowed to carry weapons of any sort, but to use persuasion only. During the strike, crime in the city decreased. The commander of the U.S. Army detachment sent into the area told the strikers committee that in 40 years of military experience he hadn't seen so quiet and orderly a city. A poem printed in the Seattle Union Record, a daily newspaper put out by labor people by someone named Annis. What scares them most is that nothing happens. They are ready for disturbances. They have machine guns and soldiers, but this smiling silence is uncanny. The businessmen don't understand that sort of weapon. It is your smile that is upsetting, the reliance on artillery, brother. It is their garbage weapons that go along the street, marked exempt by a strike committee. It is the milk stations that are getting better daily, and the 300 war veterans of labor handling the crowds without guns, for these speak of a new power and a new world that they do not feel at home in. The mayor swore in 2,400 special deputies, many of them students at the University of Washington. Almost 1,000 sailors and Marines were brought into the city by the U.S. government. The general strike ended after 5 days, according to the General Strike Committee, because of the pressure of the international officers of various unions, as well as the difficulties of living in a shut-down city. The strike had been peaceful, but when it was over, there were raids and arrests, and the Socialist Party headquarters on the printing plant, 39 members of the IWW were jailed as ringleaders of the Anarchy. In Centralia, Washington, where the IWW had been organizing lumber workers, and the lumber interests made plans to get rid of the IWW. On November 11th, 1919, Armistice Day, the Legion paraded through town with rubber hoses and gas pipes, and the IWW prepared for an attack. When the Legion passed the IWW hall, shots were fired. It is unclear who fired first. They stormed the hall. There was more firing, and 3 Legion men were killed. Inside the headquarters was an IWW member, a lumberjack named Frank Everett, who had been in France as a soldier while the IWW international leaders were on trial for obstructing the war effort. Everett was in army uniform and carrying a rifle. He emptied it into the crowd, dropped it, and ran for the woods, followed by a mob. He started to wade across the river, found the current too strong, turned, shot the leading man dead, and threw his gun into the river and fought the mob with fists. They dragged him back into town behind an automobile, suspended him from a telegraph pole, took him down, locked him in jail. That night, his jailhouse door was broken down. He was dragged out, put on the front of a car, his genitals were cut off, and then he was taken to a bridge, hanged, and his body riddled with bullets. No one was ever arrested for Everett's murder, but 11 Wobbles were put on trial for killing an American Legion leader during the parade, and 6 of them spent 15 years in prison. Why such a reaction to the general strike, to the organization of the Wobblies? A statement by the mayor of Seattle suggests that the establishment feared not just the strike itself, but what it symbolized, he said. The so-called sympathetic Seattle strike was an attempted revolution. That there was no violence does not alter the fact. The intent, openly and covertly announced, was the overthrow of the industrial system here first, then everywhere. True, there were no flashing guns, no bombs, no killings. Revolution, I repeat, doesn't need violence. Revolution, I repeat, doesn't need violence. The general strike, as practiced in Seattle, is of itself the weapon of revolution. All the more dangerous because quiet. To succeed, it must suspend everything, stop the entire stream of life of a community. That is to say, it puts the government out of operation. And that is all there is to revolt, no matter how achieved. Furthermore, the Seattle General Strike took place in the midst of a wave of post-war rebellions all over the world. A writer of The Nation commented that year, "The most extraordinary phenomenon at the present time is the unprecedented revolt of the rank and file. In Russia, it has dethroned the Tsars. In Korea and in India and in Egypt and Ireland, it keeps up an unyielding resistance to political tyranny. In England, it brought about the railway strike against the judgment of the men's own executives. In Seattle and San Francisco, it has resulted in the stevedores' recent refusal to handle arms or supplies destined for the overthrow of the Soviet government. In one district of Illinois, it manifested itself in a revolution of striking miners, unanimously requesting their state executive to go to hell. In Pittsburgh, according to Mr. Gompers, it compelled the reluctant American Federation officers to call the strike the steel strike, lest the control pass into the hands of the IWW and other radicals. In New York, it brought about the longshoremen strike and kept the men out in defiance of union officials. It caused the upheaval in the printing trade, which the international officers, even though the employers worked hand in glove with them, were completely unable to control. The common man, losing faith in the old leadership, has experienced a new access of self-confidence, or at least a new recklessness. A readiness to take chances on his own account. Authority cannot any longer be imposed from above. It comes automatically from below. Well, this stuff sounds familiar, like stuff that almost happened with the Bernie Revolution. In the steel mills of western Pennsylvania later in 1919, where men worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, doing exhausting work under intense heat, 100,000 steel workers were signed up in 20 different AFL craft unions. A national committee attempting to tie them together in their organizing drive found in the summer of 1919 the men are letting it be known that if we do not do something for them, they will take the matter into their own hands. The National Council was getting telegrams like one from the Johnston Steel Workers Council. Unless the National Committee authorizes a national strike vote to be taken this week, we will be compelled to go on strike here alone. William Z. Foster, later a communist leader, at this time Secretary-Treasurer of the National Committee in charge of organizing, received a telegram from organizers in the Youngstown district. We cannot be expected to meet the enraged workers who will consider us traitors if a strike is postponed. There was pressure from President Woodrow Wilson and Samuel Gompers, the AFL president, to postpone the strike. But the steel workers were too insistent, and in September 1919, not only the 100,000 union men, but 250,000 others went out on strike. The sheriff of Allegheny County swore in as deputies 5,000 employees of the U.S. Steel who had not gone on strike, announced that outdoor meetings would be forbidden. A report of the Interchurch World Movement made at the time said, in Munson, the policy of the state police was simply to club men off the streets and drive them into their homes. In Braddock, when a striker was clubbed in the street, he would be taken to jail, kept there overnight. Many of those arrested in Newcastle were ordered not to be released until the strike was over. The Department of Justice moved in, carrying out raids on workers who were aliens, holding them for deportation. At Gary, Indiana, federal troops were called in. Other factors operated against the strikers. Most were recent immigrants and many nationalities, many languages. Sherman Services Incorporated, hired by the Steel Corporation to break the strike, instructed its men in South Chicago, "We want you to stir up as much bad feeling as possible, as you possibly can, between the Serbians and the Italians. Spread data among the Serbians that the Italians are going back to work. Urge them to go back to work or the Italians will get their jobs." More than 30,000 black workers were brought into the area as strikebreakers. They had been excluded from the AFL unions and felt no loyalty to unionism. As the strike dragged on, the mood of defeat spread and workers began to drift back to work. After 10 weeks, the number of strikers was down to 110,000, and the National Committee called off the strike. In the year following the war, 120,000 textile workers struck in New England and New Jersey, and 30,000 silk workers struck in Paterson, New Jersey. In Boston, the police went out on strike, and in New York City, cigar makers, shirt makers, carpenters, bakers, teamsters, and barbers were out on strike. In Chicago, the press reported more strikes and lockouts accompany the midsummer heat than ever before at any one time. 5,000 workers at the International 5,000 workers at the International Harvester and 5,000 city workers were in the streets. When the 20s began, however, the situation seemed under control. The IWW was destroyed, the Socialist Party falling apart, the strikes were beaten down by force, and the economy was doing just well enough for just enough people to prevent mass rebellion. Congress in the 20s put an end to the dangerous, turbulent flood of immigrants by passing laws setting immigration quotas, and quotas favored Anglo-Saxons, kept out black and yellow people, limited severely the coming of Latins, Slavs, Jews. No African country could send more than 100 people. 100 was the limit for China, for Bulgaria, for Palestine. 34,007 could come from England or Northern Ireland, but only 3,845 from Italy. 51,227 from Germany, but only 124 from Lithuania, to 28,567 from Irish Free State, but only 2,248 from Russia. The Ku Klux Klan was revived in the 1920s, and it spread into the North. By 1924, it had 4.5 million members. The NAACP seemed helpless in the face of mob violence and the race hatred everywhere. The impossibility of the black person ever being considered equal in America was the theme of the nationalist movement led in the 1920s by Marcus Garvey. He preached black pride, racial separation, and the return to Africa, which to him held the only hope for black unity and survival. But Garvey's movement, inspiring as it was to some blacks, could not make much headway against the powerful white supremacy currents in the post-war decade. There was some truth to the standard picture of the 20s at the time, of prosperity and fun, the jazz age, the roaring 20s. Unemployment was down from 4,270,000 in 1921 to a little over 2 million in 1927. The general level of wages for workers rose. Some farmers made a lot of money. The 40% of the 40% of all families who made over $2,000 a year could buy new gadgets, autos, radios, refrigerators. Millions of people were not doing badly, but they could shut out the picture of others, the tenement farmers, black and white, the immigrant families, in the big cities, either without work or not making enough money to get the basic necessities. But the prosperity was concentrated at the top, while from 1922 to 1929, real wages in manufacturing went up per capita 1.4% a year. The holders of common stocks gained 16.4% a year. 6 million families, 42% total, made less than $1,000 a year. 0.1% of the families at the top received as much income as 42% of the families at the bottom, according to a report of the Brookings Institute. Every year in the 1920s, about 25,000 workers were killed on the job and 100,000 permanently disabled. 2 million people in New York City lived in tenements, condemned as fire traps. The country was full of little industrial towns like Munis, Indiana, where, according to Robert and Helen Lynn, the class system was revealed by the time people got up in the morning. 2/3 of the city's family, the father gets up in the dark in the winter, eats hastily in the kitchen in the gray dawn, and is at work from an hour to 2.25 hours before his children have to be at school. There were enough well-off people to push the others into the background, and the rich controlling the means of dispensing information. Who would tell? Historian Merle Curtu observed about the 20s. It was, in fact, only the upper 10% of the population that enjoyed a marked increase in real income. But the protests which such facts normally have evoked could not make themselves widely or effectively felt. This was in part the result of the grand strategy of the major political parties. In part, it was the result of the fact that almost all the chief avenues to mass opinion were now controlled by large-scale publishing industries. Well, that's all I'm going to read tonight. That just sounds just like today. It's like history is repeating itself. That with the income inequality that we have in America today, and that is perpetuated by both of the parties in power. Both the Republican and the Democrat Party seems to want to keep it as it is, to keep all the wealth at the top and just barely enough at the bottom. And anyway, that's all for tonight in the Chapel of Poetry prose reading, and this is The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn.